Okay, so thanks everyone for joining this discussion today for Dying Matters Week. Slightly different to the normal discussions that we have, but hopefully it will still be as useful and interesting. Today we're going to be talking about what it means to be in a good place to die. That's the theme of this year's Dying Matters Week, and we're joined by colleagues from across Trinity today to help us talk about that theme. We're going to start just by introducing ourselves. My name's Polly Balsam. I'm Head of Marketing and Communications here at Royal Trinity Hospice, which means I'm responsible for a lot of the information, updates and messages that go out to our community. So messages like this one today, hopefully. And I choose to work at a hospice because after seeing the incredible impact that amazing end-of-life care had for a friend of mine at another hospice, it made me want to work somewhere that I could contribute in some small way to that fantastic impact. So let's introduce ourselves. Fiona, if you'd like to make a start.
Hi there, thanks Polly. My name's Fiona Turnbull. I'm one of the counsellors here at Trinity Hospice, and I'm part of the patient and family support team. So that means we offer a range of support. My particular role is working to offer counselling for patients, including our community patients, family members, and then I'm also part of the bereavement service, so offering counselling support to people after somebody they love has died. I work and I feel really privileged to work here. I really love the opportunity to be with people at this incredibly sensitive, precious, difficult, challenging time in their lives, and yeah, to give people the opportunity to share how they feel and to work through some of what they might be finding particularly difficult as they approach the end of life, and then for family members afterwards.
Thanks, Fiona. Marsha?
Hello, I'm Marsha Hewitt and I'm the Welfare Rights Advisor. I also work within the Patient and Family Support team. My job is to help people apply for benefits that they're entitled to, deal with other money issues, do rehousing, concessionary travels, that's blue badges, freedom passes, that can help people get around more easily, advocacy, which I absolutely love, and I love being able to share my knowledge, what I've gained over the years, dealing with the benefit system, which can be a minefield for people. So I love being able to do that and make things easier for people, and I will take on that stress and give them the positive answer.
That's a great intro, Marsha. Thank you. And finally, Dallas.
Hi everybody, I'm Dallas Pounds and I'm Chief Executive at Royal Trinity Hospice, but also by training I am a registered general nurse, and in fact I worked 10 years as a specialist palliative care nurse, both in hospices and in the community as well. So I am very passionate about changing society's relationship with living, but also with death and with dying. So it's a great pleasure to be on the panel today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Let's get started, shall we? So the first question I have feels quite simple, but that's because we all work for a hospice and we're all familiar with the phrases that we use. So hospices like Trinity, we look at a person's physical, emotional, spiritual, social and practical needs, and we provide support and expertise to help alleviate symptoms and help them cope with what they're experiencing at any time. So when we talk about being in a good place to die, we need to explore what that means for them in all those different ways, physically, emotionally, spiritually, but also things like financially and digitally. Advanced care planning, which we talk about a lot here, can help people think through their options. But Dallas, tell us about what it means in practice and what are the sorts of things people should be thinking about.
While we're talking about this for Dying Matters Week, and we are talking about dying, what we mustn't forget is this is equally important for people who lose capacity as well. So everything that we talk about during this panel, do bear in mind that it's in case you lose your capacity to make your own decisions, as well as if you die. And also that dying doesn't necessarily happen with warning. We don't necessarily see our deaths approaching, and therefore we also have to think about making these plans and thinking about advanced care planning in case we should die suddenly. So it's not just about simple things, or it might seem simple things like writing a will. There's a whole lot more to this. Writing a will is incredibly important, and we know that only about 1/3 of the population have written a will. But it's about making sure that that will and maybe some accompanying instructions really do capture your wishes and your preferences, maybe not just for your money or your possessions, but about your funeral, practical arrangements and your preferences. Potentially for where you'd like to be cared for up until when you die, and your preferences for after you die. It's about thinking about things from a practical point of view, about supporting those that you're leaving behind. So a power of attorney, both for your finances and for your health as well, can have helped leading up to your death if you have lost capacity on the way. You need to think about your digital and social legacy as well. Your Twitter won't just switch off, your Facebook won't just close. So you need to think about going on and making legacy contacts for your social media, or perhaps leaving a sneaky password somewhere for someone. So advanced care planning is actually a lot of practical paperwork, if you like, to bring together. But that becomes meaningless if you don't have conversations about it. If you haven't shared those thoughts and those plans with those that are near to you, or those you want to be the executor of your will, of your plans. So you need to have some brave and courageous conversations and prepare the paperwork, but then you need to store that paperwork, put it away, pop it in a box and get on with living. And then just take it out every so often when life changes and just review it and bring it up to date. So I would say you need to talk, you need to plan, then you need to store and get on living.
Thanks, Dallas. That's a great answer, and you've hit the nail on the head there with the difference between what we all know we should be doing and what's actually quite difficult to do. And let's get into that a bit maybe with Fiona about having those difficult conversations. We know working here at the hospice that a lot of people do put off having those conversations, and often it's very difficult or painful to think about having those conversations, but then it can be too late to have those conversations effectively. And in fact, 3/4 of people haven't written down their wishes. So if you have and you're watching this, you're definitely in the minority. Half of us haven't had a discussion with our partners about what we'd like for the end of life. So it's not about being close to someone. Often that maybe even makes it harder. So Fiona, how do we begin those difficult conversations? And Dallas has kind of spoken a bit about the benefits of having those conversations, but in your experience working in a hospice, what can be the implications of not sharing plans or making plans?
Well, I think that's a really great question, Polly. And what I would say, first of all, is that I think it's such an understandable and natural instinct to want to kind of protect the people that we're close to. And often that can lead us to feel quite reluctant to have the kinds of conversations that we're talking about today, the kinds of things that Dallas was just talking about. Sometimes we can end up avoiding those kind of conversations. And actually what we know from a lot of people here that we talk with, whether that's patients or family members, is that it can often feel like a relief to be able to have those conversations, to be able to say, this is what I want, these are my priorities, these are the things that really matter to me. And I think that actually some of the implications of not doing that is that there can be missed opportunities. So actually things that somebody might hold really dear, that might be where they die, it might be what they hoped for people that they love after they've died. If that hasn't been communicated, then there are some real missed opportunities. So I think that instinct to protect it's so understandable, but it can also sometimes mean that, you know, we don't have those conversations. And what a lot of people tell us is that it can feel like a relief, it can feel quite liberating. It can often be an opportunity not just to talk about the practical stuff, although that's really, really important, but it can actually create opportunities to share more personally, perhaps, you know, to have those conversations, the things that you don't want to leave unsaid, to tell people how much, you know, they matter to you, to say, you know, we had a tough time and I really want to end my life on good terms with you. So, you know, I think it can often be a gateway into really quite profound, meaningful conversations, really touching, moving conversations that are really important. So I think sometimes it's really easy. We talk about them as difficult conversations, and I wouldn't for a minute pretend that they're not difficult, but I think they can be lots of other things as well, and they can have a real value. The other thing I would say in terms of how to have these conversations, I don't think there's a blueprint. Everyone's different. Every family is different. Every couple is unique, you know, so you will know better than anyone else how you like to communicate, what's important to you. So for some people, actually, it's really much easier to kind of do it on their own, to kind of think, okay, I like to think it through for myself, and then maybe I'll write it down and communicate it to others. For a lot of people, it might be it's more helpful to sit down with somebody, either, like you said, Dallas, you know, someone you know and trust, or it might be somebody who's a professional that you know and trust, and to talk it through. So you might actually start the conversation feeling quite uncertain about what your wishes are, and that's okay. And in the process of talking, you reach a point where you feel clearer about what it is that you want, both about dying, about your death, and about what happens after you die. I think the other thing that I would just add is sometimes we build it up as a big conversation, and often, and I think for our patients, it actually can often be helpful if there is time to have it as conversations over a period of time. It doesn't have to all happen in one go. That might be your preference, and that's absolutely fine. But actually, sometimes it's just kind of dipping your toe in the water, starting the conversation and coming back to it at another time. Or, you know, there are lots of decisions, you know, there are lots of things to think about. Think about one of them at a time, rather than trying to do everything all at once, which can feel overwhelming. So those are just some thoughts, I think, Polly, about the kind of how as well as the why.
That's great, Fiona, thank you. And we'll be sharing some links with this video of websites that might have some resources that would be helpful to start having those conversations. I won't call them difficult, that probably makes them even more difficult, but also things to think about, because I think often what I hear from colleagues at Trinity is that it's also sometimes difficult to know what questions you need to ask yourself. So what can you make a decision about, and what are you in control of as well? So we will share some links with that. Okay, so we'll move on to our next question. Something that we talk a lot about at Trinity are myths that people think about hospices, especially, but the things that you wish people didn't assume, that when they hear that you work in a hospice, or things that people think about death and dying that aren't quite right. And I know personally that it frustrates certain colleagues of mine who, you know, they'll tell somebody that they work in a hospice, and someone will say, oh, that must be so depressing, or, you know, you're such a good person because that must be so hard. And actually, anyone who's been to Trinity knows that it's the furthest from a depressing place a lot of the time that it could be. So, Marsha, those myths prevail outside hospices as well, in the kind of the death and dying worlds of funerals and religious ceremonies and things like that. Is there anything particular that you get frustrated about when you hear an assumption that's being made, or a myth that you'd really wish people didn't believe in?
I think the major one is the concern that people are concerned that they're going to inherit their loved one's debt, when is not always necessarily the case. Does cause a lot of unnecessary stress and worry at times, and that does come up quite often. Another one I think would be definitely the importance of lasting power of attorney. the assumption that just because somebody is, you know, named as a next of kin, that it then gives them the right to act on their behalf when they've lost capacity. So that's very important, and getting it completed in time as well. And then next to that is having a will in place. Again, just by saying you're just, you know, a next of kin is not going to give you the rights to go in and, you know, empty the bank account, for example. So it's very important for people to get that in place, not to make those assumptions. Shop around for funeral directors. Don't just take the first one that offers it, and it's not very nice to kind of think about shopping around, but there's different costs. Thinking about how to keep those down. There's such things as direct cremations as well. You don't have to have a big ceremony if you don't want that. And the best way really to get that across to your loved ones, family, friends, is by doing a funeral plan. Put some money aside, if you're able to, put down your wishes in your will and your funeral plan, and then that is a concern that your loved ones don't have to kind of deal with. It's there. So that's kind of one that needs to, I think, be sorted out.
Thanks. It comes back to conversations and thinking about the future, what we were just talking about, really, doesn't it?
It does. It does. And I think the earlier it's done, if you're able to, the better. It's kind of like put it down on a to-do list. You know, lasting power of attorney, tick. A will, tick. Funeral plan, tick. Those are the main ones.
And Fiona and Dallas, is there anything that, from your point of view, you worry that people are going to make assumptions about around some of what Marsha just said, or the kind of the less practical side of things?
Yeah, I think that Marsha's touched on it, but I think this belief that people have that they need to do funerals and cremations in certain ways, and you absolutely don't have to. You don't have to use a funeral director if you don't want to. You don't have to have a costly plan if you don't want to. You certainly don't have to have anybody from any sort of religious or spiritual background taking the service for you. It's your time to do that. And I personally, I get very frustrated with people believing that funerals have to be certain ways. And there are still lots of myths, even just around coffins. You know, is it better for the environment to have a cardboard coffin or a wicker coffin or a wooden coffin? And I don't mean to sound trivial, but sometimes those things can be really, really meaningful to the person who's dying, or indeed to their family. So you do need to think about things like that, and flowers and music, all of those things. I think people feel that they're almost powerless, and they're not. You have the power to make those decisions. But just to reiterate what Marsha said, this belief that because you are next of kin, you suddenly are a powerful person in all of this. You are not, without the paperwork to back you up.
And I think for me, I'm not sure it's a myth, but I think it can be a fear that people have, that if I talk about this, it's going to somehow make it happen, or that it's actually, that it's a kind of a conversation that will almost kind of cancel out, you know, getting, like Dallas was saying right at the start, you know, being able to carry on with living. And actually, I see them very much kind of side by side. So I think there is often a fear about having these kinds of conversations, or doing the kinds of things that Marsha was talking about. But in a way, they often enable, as Dallas said at the start, and enable people to make those decisions, know that they're made, and then prioritise other things.
Absolutely. Thanks, Fiona. I think that leads us really nicely on to the next thing I wanted to ask Dallas about, which is we're talking about planning and when things can be planned in advance. And even if you've had a diagnosis at that stage, and that, maybe you have a life-limiting illness, then it's time to plan. And some people choose to plan sooner. But obviously, we've seen in the last year more and more unexpected deaths, probably more than ever. And I was wondering what you think this has taught us about the importance of advanced care planning, making a will, and having those conversations kind of upfront with your loved ones.
Yeah, and I think it's a brilliant question, and something I've been going on about for years and years and years. And the fact of the matter is, we are all mortal and we will all die. And some of us will have predictors of that through diseases or conditions, and some of us won't. So I think what the last year has taught us is as well as really just reminded us is that we are mortal. And, sadly, and as much as I don't want to think about it sat here, any of us could die at any time. So that means we should not put off making these plans and having these conversations, even as we sit here as, healthy, fit adults. We should still be making those plans and having those conversations, because sudden death in some ways is well, it is incredibly difficult. In some ways, it's more difficult than knowing a death is approaching. And when you are left in that state of shock and grief and bereavement, to have plans written down, to have had those conversations, reduces the amount of guessing you have to do. It can reduce conflict between family members, and it gives a kind of reassurance to you that you had those conversations and you're doing what that person you cared about wanted. I've experienced this just myself in the last month, and because we'd had those conversations, because we'd had those plans written down, it's really helped with grief and the practicalities. We knew what the funeral needed to look like, and we knew what those wishes were. So I would say this last year hopefully has just made us all realise that we are mortal, and that we owe it to ourselves and to those that we leave behind to not put something on a to-do list, but to actually get it done.
Thanks, Dallas. I think that's a lot, speaking for myself, but I'm sure a lot of people would agree that the last year has brought into sharp focus the need for having those conversations and planning. So it will be interesting to see in the kind of years ahead if advanced care planning and having those conversations become something that we just talk about more openly in society as a whole. I think we should probably talk about the fact, though, that advanced care planning, it's not a magic wand. It doesn't mean that you have your conversations, you write down your wishes, you set up your funeral fund, as Marsha was saying, and then it's fine. Nothing can go wrong. And I know, Fiona, this is something that we've talked about before. We have kind of outstanding expertise. We're a very supportive community here at Trinity. We know that we want our patients to have the best life and death possible, but we also know that things don't always go to plan. And Dallas just mentioned this to me before we started recording. But the best laid plans, there's always a chance that something's going to go wrong. And I think as Dallas was just saying, the last year's shown us that more than ever. So how can we as Trinity help people prepare for the possibility that things will go wrong, or help them cope with the fact that things have gone wrong if that does happen?
In a way, I almost think this is the hardest question to answer, because actually one of the things that we know, and Dallas has just described that really powerfully, is that actually a sudden death or an unexpected death can be very traumatic and really devastating. I mean, we've seen that so much this year, haven't we, with over 100,000 people who have died, in circumstances that they wouldn't have chosen, either, ahead of time or in hospital, away from family and friends. So I do think that that's a really, really incredibly difficult experience, and really, truly difficult and devastating for bereaved people. In terms of what we can do, I think there is something about just having that awareness that can be helpful. So to know that whilst, as you say, as a team here, we do everything we possibly can to support people to reach the end of life, to die in the way that they choose, that isn't always necessarily possible, that unexpected things can happen. That can sometimes be something like a rapid deterioration where somebody perhaps was expected to live for a few more months. That kind of thing is possible and it can happen, and it is incredibly difficult. But I think for people to know that it's important to plan, it's really essential to plan. It helps to prepare, but actually, exactly as Bella said, you know, there are things that can happen that aren't necessarily predictable or expected. I think the other thing that I would say, and it's a word that I have in mind a lot when I'm working with clients, with patients, family members and bereaved people, is compassion. So to be as compassionate to yourself as possible if things don't go according to plan. It's a really natural response, and a lot of people feel feelings like guilt or anger or blame after a death that maybe hasn't been exactly what they might have wanted for their loved one. Those are such natural feelings, and it is okay to feel them. And I think it's also important to just allow yourself to feel the full range of emotion. It's a natural response when things haven't quite gone according to plan. The other thing I would just then add to that is to, as we would always say, you know, to reach out for support. That's why we have a bereavement service here. We completely understand that actually things don't stop for a family at the point where someone dies, and that support, it's really important that we offer that support ongoing. So yeah, I think that would be how I see it. I don't know if others would add anything to that.
Yeah, if I may, I think life throws changes at us that we don't see coming. And in the very way some of us probably wrote birth plans that went completely awry once we were in the situation, all the plans we can make around approaching death and dying can change. We can change our minds as the person who is dying or as the person who's alongside the person dying. We can suddenly get something, a condition, maybe a chest infection or something, which, you know, wasn't predicted, which means we have to go into hospital. You know, there are so many variables. So absolutely, we should plan and we should talk about this, but we do need to accept that life is unpredictable. But as Fiona says, this isn't anybody's fault. This isn't anybody, nobody is to blame for this. It is just life and death. And it happens. So as much as we might prepare people for this might happen, that might happen, what if this, what if that, you know, we can't predict everything that's coming. So we just have to be alongside people, be compassionate about how they feel about it, and accept that sometimes, as brilliant and as outstanding as we are, things don't quite go to plan.
Thanks, Dallas. Fiona actually mentioned the birth plan analogy to me a while ago when we were talking, and I thought it really stayed with me in my head of the idea of making a plan, but also planning to go off plan as well, and knowing that that's also a possibility. And I think it really kind of resonates at the end of life as well, doesn't it? Great. Well, thank you. I think our last question, I'd like to hear what everybody says, because everybody is representing such a different area of Trinity, has different experiences. But we'll start with Marsha, who you'll tell me exactly how many years, but I know that you've been here at Trinity for a good few years. I'm really interested to know what you've learned while working in a hospice, while working at Trinity, about preparing for death and dying, for yourself and those around you, and how has that influenced your own plans and your own wishes? I appreciate this is quite a personal question, so feel free to share as much as you're comfortable to share.
Yeah, been here quite a while. It's just coming up 10 years, I think, this year. So yeah, it's flown in a good way. Never mind what's gone on this past year. Yeah, I think working within a hospice has taught me quite a lot. I think death and dying is so taboo. It's a subject that people don't like to kind of talk about or think about. And then especially when you bring into it finances. So one of the most important things was to ensure that I've got a will, and it can be amended when need be, because as time goes on, things change. To make sure all my paperwork is signed correctly, so all my next of kin are named in regards to pensions. So it gets shared out to who I want it to be sent out to. Funerals is a big one. I actually had a discussion with my mother about it, and I said you need to have a funeral plan. Because they can be quite costly. I really don't want to be getting myself into debt for it. It might sound a bit harsh, but it's the reality of it. I have a family as well, and she does work. So yep, I heavily encouraged her to have a funeral plan, and explained obviously that if she didn't, it would be on the cheaper side of things. Again, I have my own family and bills to pay, love my mum to bits. So that was one thing in regards to funerals. I've spoken to my own immediate family about it, and insisted I want to be cremated. It's the cheaper option. No flowers. I think for me personally, I think it's kind of pointless, and a waste of money. And much rather that money was donated. So yeah, I think that's really kind of what it taught me. Oh, and lasting power of attorney that I need to be doing. And spoken to my husband about it as well, and my other family members, just to let them know this is what I'm planning to do, and who I want to be my attorneys if anything happens and I'm able to act on my own. So it's a lot of forward thinking, and I think if anything, what we've gone through in the past year kind of highlighted it even more, so that it's very important, because yes, as it was said, death could just suddenly happen just like that. So yeah, that's an additional lesson learned from here. I suppose in a bit working here, you kind of get used to seeing people deteriorate, whether that is slowly or it's fast, but it's slower than an imminent death as such. So that's the main things that I've learned about it.
Thank you, Marsha. Thanks for sharing the detail there. So as I said, I do appreciate it's a personal question. Dallas and Fiona, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I was thinking about one of the things that we've been talking about is how to have conversations. And one of the things that I think I've been really lucky enough to work here for 3 years, and prior to that had long involvement as a volunteer. So I've been around Trinity for a long time, and I think it does. If I think about within my family, I do think that the conversation, my kids joke about my little bit on my bookshelf that has a whole load of titles that include the words death and dying, and actually I think that it means it is a very it's just a topic of conversation that does feel quite natural, because of the work that I do, and I'm really pleased about that, because I think it does mean you know, they're not afraid to talk about death and dying, and nor am I. But the other thing I would just say that actually occurred to me earlier is that I do think we also have to kind of recognise people will be at different levels of readiness to have these kind of conversations. So whilst it's, you know, it is easy for us in some ways to sit here and say, you know, these are the really good things to do and it will help your loved ones and it is important. Actually, I know from my own experience that different people will have different levels of readiness to have those conversations. So I think I would want to kind of just add that, you know, if somebody is reluctant or finds it, you know, particularly difficult, there is something about kind of recognizing not everyone might feel comfortable to have these conversations or might feel safe enough to have these conversations. If I think about, you know, my own family, you know, I've had different kinds of conversations with different people, and I think that is to do with, you know, how ready somebody might be to think about their own death.
And I'm just a complete and utter death and dying bore, really. Having been in and around palliative care for well over 20 years, yeah, I've had lots of different conversations with lots of different people, some that have completely stopped dinner parties in their tracks, and others where people get really enthused and go away and start writing wills and planning. But I think from a personal point of view, if I get it right, my aim will be that those I've left behind will have as easy an experience as possible resulting from my death, that they will know what to do and how to do it. There'll be the money there to do it as well. And I'm sure I'll have forgotten something. We get it out of the box every couple of years and have a look at it as my children have got older. But one of the things that I've said to them really, really firmly is that I don't want them to create a memorial. I don't want a stone, or I don't want a place where they feel they have to go and visit me and look after me. That's the one thing that's really important to me. But as for the rest of it, if they want to play music and sing songs and read poems, that's all good, because that part of the proceedings is for them and what they need. But as long as they have the easiest experience possible at the hardest time possible, then I'll be happy.
Thanks, Alice. I feel as if I should add my opinion here as well, rather than just ask everybody theirs. I think I was thinking about this, and something that I've really noticed, having been here almost exactly the same length of time as Fiona, about 3 years, is how my openness to say the D words and have that conversation in a public forum and not feel like we're building up to this big conversation, as Fiona was saying earlier, it does encourage others to feel more comfortable about it. And having had a family bereavement earlier this year, I know that that certain people that I'm close to, I found opened up more and were able to name words that beforehand, you know, they might mouth instead, or say the euphemisms for all the euphemisms that we've heard in the past. So I've really noticed that the impact on other people that I'm close to from working at a hospice and hearing me say, you know, death, dying, died, and talk about planning and talk about these things out loud rather than mouthing them as maybe they used to do has been really noticeable to me. So that's probably one of the big things that I've learned, is that it kind of rubs off on people having those conversations and being relaxed and comfortable enough to just bring it out into the light. It does rub off on people. So we've come to the end of our questions. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining today. We hope that you've enjoyed watching this video or these short videos. As I mentioned, there'll be some accompanying links to some really helpful materials and resources. So please take your time and have a look in your own time when you feel comfortable to do so. Thanks to Fiona, Marsha and Alice for joining. And hopefully we'll see you again another time.